Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Richard Lummis is on assignment this week, so I'm joined by Nick Gallo, and we take a look at Doris Kearns Goodwin's class on leadership in the MasterClass. We consider leadership lessons from Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and Abraham Lincoln. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I am joined today by Nick Gallo, and we are going to take things a little bit different direction because we both recently took the virtual or online masterclass by Doris Kearns Goodwin on leadership. And we both found it to be just a great class. She focuses on presidential leadership. And so I asked Nick if maybe we could do a podcast on it, and he thought that was a good idea. So we thought we would visit with you all today about some of the lessons we learned and how really the study of leadership at any level can bring lessons learned down to you in whatever leadership role you have, leadership issues you have, or just the way you conduct yourself on a day-to-day basis. So, Nick, an incredibly long-winded introduction. First of all, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to visit with me today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Tom. Glad to be here. I'm excited to dive into this topic. This course was super interesting, and I feel like I really learned a lot about these presidents that were really just kind of two-dimensional for me before I got to know him a bit.
So the master class is I always love plugging people who don't pay me for plugs because I'm a voracious learner, and the master class popped up, I guess, about maybe 24 months ago, and they've been adding classes. I've taken all of the leadership classes, the writing classes, the history classes. They're far beyond that as well, but those are the things that interest me, and they have really some top-notch practitioners in all fields. So, but I wanted to say a few words about Doris Kearns Goodwin. She came on my radar when I was in college, and she was Doris Kearns back then. It was before she got married, and she wrote a book entitled Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, and that book came out in '77. I think I was a sophomore in college, and I am a huge Lyndon Johnson fan. He may be one of the world's biggest SOBs, but he's my SOB. So take that. And he's a fellow Texan. Nevertheless, she had been a White House fellow. Johnson invited her to come to the Johnson's Ranch in Johnson City, Texas. And she there helped him work on his memoirs, but also ended up writing this biography of him. And the thing that struck me about that book, and has struck me about all of her books, is that she, that we're going to talk about throughout this podcast, is she really gets down to where you feel like you know the person, and you know them on a personal level. And the chances of me ever knowing a president very closely on a personal level are probably nil, but I felt like I knew Johnson from that book and then her subsequent book. So also, she's a huge baseball fan, so that's a big one in my eyes as well. She was on Ken Burns' series Baseball about her experiences as a child when she would read the box score to her father, and I'm a huge box score guy, still am. So that resonates with me. She's won the Pulitzer Prize. She's won National Book Awards. She is, I think, a well-known professional historian, a popular historian, and someone that I really enjoy reading because she's a great writer. So that's a little bit about Tom on Doris Kearns Goodwin. Really, any thoughts from you, Nick, on your perspective?
Yeah, I've never read those tomes that she writes. I added a couple to my list because they're super interesting. I mean, after kind of going through this course, it definitely sparked my interest in kind of diving deeper. But, what you said about her, I think, was carried through to this course. I mean, this was a little brief survey of these 4 presidents. And I feel like she very quickly is able to your point, kind of pull the humanity of them off the page. And you can kind of, add some 3-dimensionality to them. And you feel like, okay, I kind of get what kind of a guy this person was. And you can kind of feel like you get to know him a little bit. So, I just found her to be very kind of thoughtful, and just the way that she was able to, she didn't make it very stuffy. She made it very, she kind of brought these guys alive, which made it very relatable.
So, Nick, I wanted to start with kind of the basic question, and I don't know where you answered this before you started this course, but years ago, I was under the impression, now I think mistakenly, that great leaders were really born. And that whatever skills I had may or may not translate into great leadership, but I was stuck with the skills I had and they couldn't be improved. I've really come around to thinking now that that's incorrect, that you have to have certain things that I think we're going to talk about throughout this series. But so let me just pitch the question to you. Are great leaders born or made?
Yeah, I think I was like you. I think for a long time I thought that they were just made, or that they were just born. Like, you're just born with these certain skills, and this is a great leader. And hey, if you don't have these things, then you're never going to ascend to that position. I think I'm like you also, Tom, that I'm on the other side of the fence now. I think that they're definitely made. I think the skills that go into leadership are all kind of learned skills, and they're skills that like we can hone. I mean, it's kind of like this, right? You may have a certain kind of, artistic inclination, or you may be a sort of natural athlete, but you're never going to ascend to the majors without like a lot of practice, a lot of refinement of those skills. And I think the same holds true for leadership. You may be a naturally gregarious person or a naturally extroverted person, but that's not enough to sort of become a great leader. Some of the qualities of a great leader, I think, are all learned things, like empathy. Like, how do you learn to listen actively? How do you create an environment that lets people fail? How do you create an environment that lets people put their neck out and walk through walls for you, or an environment that allows for people to debate you? And separately, I think there's no archetype of a leader that is the same across personalities, right? You see, I mean, even these 4, right? This whole course was about Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and LBJ. And all these guys, I think, are phenomenal leaders. And they're all extremely, extremely different. So how then could they become great leaders if they all don't have the same qualities? Well, it's because they've learned those basic leadership qualities and were able to fill in the gaps with people around them to become, that more impactful leader. So I think they're absolutely made, not born.
So in terms of one of the things that struck me later in life was, I believe it was Malcolm Gladwell, he talked about the 10,000 hour rule. And to really master a subject matter, an expertise, you had to spend 10,000 hours in it. And one of the businesses I guess you would say, he pointed to is the Beatles, and the time they spent both in Liverpool and in Hamburg. But he pointed to others, baseball players and others. Is that type of hard work something you see consistently in the leaders? And maybe we should just name the 4 who she talked about.
Yeah. So she talked about Abraham Lincoln. She talked about Teddy Roosevelt. She talked about Franklin Roosevelt, and she talked about Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I think you nailed it, Tom. Like, that hard work, that intentional work is the key to it. And that's really what struck me with all these guys, is they were really extremely hard workers. The mission that they were on was bigger than themselves. The impact that they were trying to make was bigger than their own sort of physical limitations, and they pushed themselves beyond those physical limitations time and time again to handle a certain issue or write a certain speech or do whatever they needed to do. And that is very important piece of the puzzle, because to your point, I mean, listen, there's a ton of people in the professional world, for example, who can't type. They spend their entire day on the computer. So they've spent more than 10,000 hours, for example, hunting and pecking. But it's that intentional work, it's that intentional practice during those 10,000 hours that really help you accelerate. And I think each one of these guys, you saw them apply efforts toward getting better, toward being a better leader, intentionally trying to make that impact. And I think it showed up in the legacy that they left behind.
So, Nick, one of the things that I saw in these 4 leaders was certainly the ability to inspire men and women to follow them, but also to not simply lead based upon a plan and do more than react to circumstances that came up, but actually embrace the unexpected and be able to pivot when new information became available, when new data became available. And that seems to be a critical element. I suppose everyone now understands that, because we're recording this in August of 2020, when all of us are living through something that none of us had experienced before. At least I don't know anyone who was living during the Spanish influenza, but maybe there are those people who could counsel us. But we are certainly in unexpected and uncharted territories for businesses as diverse as my podcast business and your hotline business and everything else in between. And so the ability to embrace that unexpected and not only to use it, but actually, or to overcome it, but to use it to their advantage seems to me to be something. But I would also say that what I saw was preparation. And so if I could use the example of Theodore Roosevelt, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he was heavily influenced by a book by Alfred Mahan about the influence of sea power upon history. And that influence was to have a series of coaling stations, which was the fuel in the 1900s or 1800s for ships around the world. And from these coaling stations, the U.S. Navy could then have, if not command of the seas, travel on the seas. Well, he had that philosophy in place. And when the war with Spain started, he was able to cable Admiral Dewey, who I believe was in Hong Kong, to go immediately to Manila Bay and have a stunning victory with a speed that was unseen at that time, which was 1898. A lot of people call that luck, but it's been my experience that when preparation meets opportunity, luck tends to occur. And that's that embrace of the unexpected, but it's an embrace because you're prepared. Would you find that to be consistent with some of these other presidents?
Yeah, I think that's totally spot on. Many times what looks like luck and looks like serendipity only looks that way because, to your point, you don't see those hours of preparation and all those moves that happen behind the scenes to allow, in this case, that victory to take place. I think that foresight you see throughout all these guys. Like, these were not kind of guys playing whack-a-mole. These were guys playing chess, and they were thinking several moves ahead, and they understood the sort of social dynamics and sort of the countrywide dynamics that they were up against. And I think they did a lot of smart things to kind of get out ahead of the curve. I think one thing that Lincoln did, which I thought was super smart, both kind of from a political standpoint, but also from an operational or a functional standpoint, was, when he won the presidency, he basically took all of his rivals and he made those guys his main advisors. And that gave him some great insights, not only into what the positions of these various sort of groups around the country were, but it also helped him craft a solution that was going to work with the constraints that everybody was kind of bringing to the table. So had he not done that, then when it came time for him to push his Emancipation Proclamation, it maybe wouldn't have been thoughtful, or it wouldn't have gone off as successfully as it did, because he didn't, because he wouldn't have done that sort of that pre-work or that kind of homework to prepare him to be a success when that came out.
Nick, you bring up a great point, and obviously with Godwin's book, A Team of Rivals, she wrote extensively about that. It was a fabulous book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it to everyone. But having not so much rivals, but having people who are not only very smart, but can fill in gaps that you might not have expertise in seems to also be a common theme. Is that something you saw as well?
Yeah, I think there was two good examples of that. Lincoln was a good example of that. He's someone who, I don't know, he seemed like a bright eye and bushy tail kind of guy. He could only see the good in people. He had a real hard time saying no. He had a real hard time sending those hot letters. He had a hard time firing people and stuff like that. So I think because of that and that level of self-awareness that he had, he knew that he needed to fill in the blanks. And I think he got Stanton to come in there and be his kind of to be his heavy hand and to pull the trigger when he wasn't able to. But again, like, there's no sort of fully actualized man or fully actualized person. There's no sort of God man who can hit all these qualities and live those things out. So part of our job, I think, as leaders is to understand, hey, I'm great at this. I'm okay at this. I stink at this. Well, let me find somebody who's going to be a real compliment to me so that my quote unquote administration and whatever sort of quote unquote presidency I'm in can be as effective as possible. But if you're trying to do it all yourself, I think none of these guys did it all themselves. All these guys were low ego enough to surround themselves with smart people to complement them and to help push their mission forward.
And Nick, that brings up a point I wanted to maybe spend a little time exploring, which was decision-making and managing in a crisis. I think that all of these leaders had good decision-making skills, and by that I mean they had a process they followed. They may not have always reached the correct decision, but they followed a rigorous process. And although not in this series, one of my favorite stories around the Cuban Missile Crisis was that when Kennedy asked Eisenhower for advice, Eisenhower said, "What was your decision-making process?" He was more concerned about the vetting process. Were all opinions put on the table? Were they thoroughly vetted? Were they thoroughly discussed? And that's really what I saw here. I was the most familiar with FDR because I've studied him the most, but also with LBJ and his passage of the Civil Rights Act. He didn't command the field. He certainly took in the advice of others. He rejected some advice to go further. He did what he thought he could get through the Congress. But once he decided on that, he pushed it through. But FDR, in the Depression, it seemed in the early part of the Depression, he was really willing to try a wide variety of things. Some worked, some didn't. Some are still with us today in terms of government agencies. If you want to think, the best example I can think of right now is Hoover Dam. Started during the Depression, still supplying power to Las Vegas, Southern California, and Arizona today. But also his decision-making during World War II, because he had fabulous advisors. General Marshall was the chief of staff of the Army and really led the discussions around the war effort. Marshall was probably an intellectually far above FDR, but FDR was able to utilize Marshall in a way that helped him manage during those crises. And I guess when you look at crisis presidencies, it doesn't get any more crises than Abraham Lincoln. So what were your thoughts on Lincoln, maybe?
So, I mean, again, I think they both, what struck me about FDR and Lincoln is that they both seem to be comfortable enough in their own skin to surround themselves with people that would lead toward the possibility of having.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership.
What's our process to come
if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Please check out our research for additional reading if you're interested in finding out more about William Howard Taft. We found the research for this podcast fascinating. I hope you'll join us again for our next series of episodes where we're going to take a deep dive into Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. I know you will enjoy it. Thanks so much for listening to this episode, and we look forward to visiting with you again. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.
I think like a yes men culture, a culture where it's really about, adulation toward the boss, so to speak, those lead to a lot of really bad outcomes. And I think it's easy when you're the president, the most powerful man in the world, to kind of fall into that. And I think the steps that these great presidents, these great leaders took to prevent that from happening, I think not only is, a wise move, it also led to some really great outcomes for them.
One of the things that struck me, Nick, was how three or at least two of these presidents dealt with tragedy, personal tragedy, in a way. And I'm going to throw LBJ in not because it's tragedy, but it impacted him so much. And what I want to talk about is Theodore Roosevelt, when he was 22, lost his wife in childbirth
Yeah, right.
2 days later, his mother died.
Right.
FDR obviously had polio when he was a young man. LBJ's first job out of college was as a teacher in a still small town in South Texas called Cotulla. And there he taught Mexican Americans, Hispanics, in a Hispanic school. And all three of those events really not so much shaped them going forward, but influenced them in ways to create lasting impact. So with Theodore Roosevelt and this is, I've studied Roosevelt fairly extensively. This is the least written part about his life. He did not really write about his grief, but this is when he went to Montana and became a rancher. And his experiences in working through that grief in Montana directly led to his creation of the National Park System. FDR took polio, and recognizing it is a great disability, he did not let that stop him. But more importantly, he took the shame of having a disease like that at that point in time and was public with it and public with cures. So it really moved forward, I think, that conversation. And Johnson, what he found was that he could take a school of very poor children whose parents were basically farm workers, fruit pickers and onion pickers in South Texas, and with training and education, he created a state-winning debate team. And that educational experience stuck with him in many ways, was the foundation of his work in the Great Society. So some of these early events really shaped all three of these men in ways that when they got into power, they used these lessons going forward. Nick, one of the other things that struck me was that they were in large part able to communicate. FDR had fireside chats. Theodore Roosevelt, he was the master of PR at the turn of the century. He could work the press in a way that no one else had really seen, and he did it by outworking everyone and giving more press conferences than everyone. It was sort of like Twitter today.
Right.
So, and here I want to maybe ask you about one of the things that struck me about you and your brother. And you seem to do these, I don't know if they're leadership lessons or, but you do these video recorded sessions with your entire ComplianceLine team, and you talk about some points and you put them up on LinkedIn. And I find this to be incredibly powerful communication sessions, not only to the people who are in the room with you guys, but also for the rest of us who view them. So I was wondering if you might just say a few words about what lessons you learned from communications, and how do you guys use that in your business today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the thing that kept kind of popping out to me during this course was like the key to this whole thing is understanding human nature. I think all these guys, depending on their circumstance and the technology at that time, to your point, were really great communicators. And that probably is a big basis for why they are continued to be thought of as like the great presidents. I mean, look, there's kind of different classes of presidents. And I think these guys are kind of among some of the best. And part of it, I think, can be attributed to that storytelling. But, to your question, the basis of all kind of human relationship is communication. There's a certain kind of dignity that we're trying to instill in our organization. We want everyone here to kind of feel a part of it. And I think, it could kind of be pulling a sheet from the, fireside chat book of music, because, what that accomplished is what we're trying to accomplish with these sessions, right? We want to give people a view into what's going on. We want to give them some transparency into sort of the challenges that we're facing, into the priorities that we have, not just to keep them in the loop, but so that they can be eyes wide open and understand how their particular function fits into this broader picture that we're trying to paint, or this broader goal that we're trying to ascend toward. So, creating that kind of communication, creating that kind of a conversation is going to start with leadership. It's going to start with being able, a willingness to sort of open up the kimono, so to speak, and share the challenges that are, that the company or the organization is facing. And I think there's a little, for us at least, there was a little bit of a fear a little bit of a hump to get over, to start sharing those things, because, sometimes you're talking about something that's not going well, or sometimes you're talking about, a failure or whatever, but we have to be able to talk about the full range of human experience, or the full range of organizational outcome, because that's the reality. Reality is our friend, and we're all kind of climbing the same mountain, subject to the same weather patterns. So that drive of trying to celebrate the wins, but also talk about the failures, I think reinforces to the team that, hey, you can stick your neck out. Failure is okay. Life is a lot more like baseball than it is like brain surgery. You can, strike out 2 out of 3 times and still wind up in the Hall of Fame. So, just talking about that continually and keeping that cadence of that conversation going allows for a lot of, inclusion, allows for a lot of, I guess ownership is really what we're trying to go for. And I think that's what, the fireside chats were able to do for the country at large. Everyone kind of saw a glimpse into, what's going on in Washington, and what's actually facing the company. And hey, we're all in this thing together. It's a really powerful mechanism that I think a lot of companies should start doing, because the benefits are just multiplicative.
Nick, perhaps we could end up with some final thoughts on either or any or all, I suppose, lessons learned, things that struck you as the most important, most significant, things you didn't know that you found particularly fascinating, or things that you're actually going to incorporate into your repertoire moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. So, I feel like I just kind of scratched the surface on a couple of these guys that I didn't really know that much about. So this definitely has prompted me to I want to learn some more about these guys and kind of the challenges that they were facing. I think I have a new appreciation for some of the parallels that we're going through right now. The country has gone through similar things at kind of the turn of the last century. The pace of life was speeding up. There were a lot of changes going on, a lot of social changes. So a lot of the things and challenges that we're facing have been, kind of rippled through our country before. So there's probably a lot to learn by, looking back there. But, the big kind of leadership takeaways that I came away with are, first, you have to give people room to fail. You have to give them that safety in the group to push the envelope and bring their unique selves to whatever process or whatever goal you're running after. And I think the other one is to really know your weakness or weaknesses. And there's no shame in having weaknesses. There's shame in hiding those weaknesses, or there's shame in not having enough self-awareness to even recognize that weakness is in place. But once you can recognize that weakness is there, well, you can begin to kind of fill your team out with some complementary folks who, again, can kind of create that human synergy, and you can really multiply your impact. But yeah, I don't know. I really loved this course. I thought it was super interesting. Really, I haven't taken a course on here that I didn't learn a ton from. But this leadership and getting this glimpse of these presidents who really I just kind of saw on in statues and in 2-dimensional pages was super insightful.
One of the things that struck me that you mentioned a little bit earlier, Nick, was just how hard these guys worked.
Yeah,
and they didn't start working that hard when they got to be president. They worked that hard all their lives.
That's a good point.
And I, once again, going back to Teddy Roosevelt, I saw his daily diary, and it was filled when he wasn't meeting, he was reading. He was reading either intellectual tracts, he was reading books, he was reading current events, and he was always learning, ravenously curious. But each one, Johnson had just unbounded, unlimited energy. Lincoln used to go at night when he wasn't receiving petitioners at the White House, would go to the War Office to read cables from the generals who sent them in. And FDR also worked extraordinarily hard. So each one of these individuals, and I think it led to something that I've always or I felt is critical for my personal growth, which is continual learning. And that if you really stop learning, then you really put yourself at a disadvantage. And frankly, one of the things I love about podcasting is I get to learn a lot. I get to meet cool people, and I get to learn about things that I really didn't have that much experience on. And frankly, I think that's how you and I met. It was through podcast with Gio, and then you and I hooked up for podcasts. So that sort of continual thirst for knowledge, continual curiosity, certainly for a chief compliance officer or general counsel type, I think that's an incredibly important part of how you can continue to succeed, even if you've reached a level of success where you think because they planted the gold bars on your shoulders, you've made it.
Yeah, it's a, that saying, like, if a shark stops swimming, it dies. Like, if we stop learning, we die. And I love the way you put that, because like Lincoln didn't just start working hard when he became president. These guys all had this sort of voracious drive to succeed, this voracious sort of appetite for learning. And, they were really pursuing, I think what struck me is, like, they were all pursuing something that was way bigger than themselves. And because it was bigger than themselves, it took all the effort that they could give. And they were super diligent and kind of pouring that effort out. And the other thing I think I've just been kind of struck with during this course is, like, you're never going to be great unless you're trying to be great. Like, these guys put a lot of effort into being a great president. They put a lot of effort into being a great leader and making a big impact on the company. None of these things just sort of randomly happened, right? There was a ton of effort that went into it. And that purposeful, focused attention and that purposeful effort is a totally necessary ingredient if ever there's going to be that massive impact made. I mean, obviously, there's still you have to be successful, and it has to be smart, and you have to, the stars have to align in some cases, but the absolute prerequisite ingredient to your point, Tom, is that hard work and that pursuit of continual improvement.
We both enjoyed this series, and frankly, I've enjoyed this podcast a lot, and I'm ready for this podcast. Maybe we can.
Me too.
You can pick one out next time, and we'll do a podcast on it.
Deal. Let's do it, man. This is it's so fun, kind of drawing these parallels between the game we're in and these other masters that have kind of gone before us. So yeah, I love it. This was a definite highlight of my Monday.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.